So here we go, week 2, and we're focused on responsible and inclusive data innovation today. So as a reminder, part of a 6-week series. Last week we had foundations of data innovation, this week going into responsible and inclusive data innovation. So responsible and inclusive data innovation, the way we're talking about this, I think, these words can be interpreted in a myriad of different ways. But we want to make sure that, data work is so extremely powerful, just something I think everyone here really appreciates. But we have to remember that no source of information is perfect. No data tool or resource is built that is built from imperfect data is perfect. And it's important that the gaps in data and data innovation work are well understood. And a core part of that is understanding who's in the data, who are our stakeholders, what are kind of the gaps and imperfections in the data work that we are pursuing in all of our data innovation projects. So we'll be sharing a lot of different ideas today. And in terms of the agenda, so I'll be kicking us off with ecosystem mapping. Who will this data innovation affect and how? A few ideas, theories, ways of thinking about your stakeholders. Andrew will then lead us into public engagement and transparency for data innovation. Brittny-Jade Saunders will be joining us and popping in and sharing the understanding biases inherent in data and data tools. Then we'll be joined by a team of 3 from the City of San Jose's data equity team to share a really interesting tool they've developed that they call the Data Equity Framework for working on data projects with city agencies. And then we'll pop into short exercise and a discussion and a few announcements on the programmatic side of things. And just for folks who just recently joined, we are recording. And also a small shift from last week is that after each presenter, we're going to pause to be able to take 1 or 2 questions before moving on. And we'll edit out the questions, so you don't have to worry about your questions kind of popping up in the public recording side of things. All right, so moving into our first session. So thinking about kind of taking a step back and thinking about stakeholders, this is something that each of you has already done some work in. I don't think that this is, a brand new concept for any of you in your data innovation Canvas work. One of the sections involved outlining stakeholders. And I think, a lot of you presented a lot of extremely, diverse stakeholders within that section about your data innovation work. And I think what's really fascinating, I started out my career in the private sector, also worked at a startup before joining city government with the City of New York. And I think that the way you think about stakeholders in city government is just so incredibly complex. And not to diminish, the importance and complexity of private sector businesses, but the work is a little bit more straightforward. You have your customers, you have the folks internally who are building the things. Within government, there's so many different groups you have to engage with. And I don't think this is a mystery to any of you. I'm seeing nodding heads. But, internally, you have maybe your leadership, a variety of different, ways of defining leadership. Legal counsel, sister initiatives and agencies, which you might sometimes see as competitors, depending on what that relationship is. And then your own team. What's considered, at least I always kind of thought of as semi-internal, might be some elected officials. Yes, they're part of your government, but there's a different kind of incentive system at play there. Legislative or executive branches, depending on where you sit in your government. Any relevant committees that might be temporary in nature, but have a very strong voice. Vendors supporting your work, project partners, and then externally. And, I think we can often bucket the public as one bucket, but really I think when we're thinking about data innovation, there is, the public at large, which there could be a whole discussion just on what that means, but also, people who are included in your data set. That's a specific subset of public stakeholders. And then related, but not necessarily the same, are members of the public potentially affected by your data innovation, advocates and media. And this is definitely not an exhaustive list. So there are most likely other stakeholders very relevant to your work. And even unpacking each one of these bullet points could yield a list of like 10 or 20 or even more stakeholders important to any data innovation. So ecosystem mapping, who will this data innovation affect and how? So I want to pause for a moment and just think of like, well, why does this matter? Like, why is this session even a part of this week's bootcamp? And I think that, we can often think about engaging stakeholders. Like, why are we engaging them? Like, what is the point? What is my incentive for getting these people involved? And I think a very common one, often the first one, is, well, I need to engage these stakeholders to get sign off or additional resources, permission from my boss to do the work, making sure with legal that I'm not breaking any laws, checking in with maybe the innovation team, maybe they can lend me some money or like some staff. And then a second very common reason for, doing ecosystem mapping, thinking about your stakeholders, is mitigating risks. And when we're talking about data innovation, there's a very specific set of risks that often come to mind. The mosaic effect is something I think is discussed more and more often. It occurs when multiple data sets are linked to reveal significant new information, which can be used for insight, but with bad actors can also lead to harm. Privacy concerns, misunderstanding the data you're collecting could happen if you don't engage certain stakeholders. There might be some poor assumptions that come into your model, your work, your data product. Improved stakeholder relations. So generally speaking, I'm sure all of us have maybe launched something or announced something, and the first email you get is from someone who says, why did I not know about this? So trying to mitigate that risk in that email or that tweet, depending on who you're mitigating the risk from, maybe even a headline. And then misinformation about data and technology. So, the work that everyone here is doing is new work. And there are a lot of biases around and strong feelings, positive or negative, around data work based on very valid reasons, sometimes misinformation, sometimes also like a lack of information. Digital and data literacy is still very nascent, it's not standardized, and getting to like understand a lot of the work that we're doing isn't necessarily straightforward for everyone involved. And then lastly, I would say a reason to do this, to engage stakeholders, to do ecosystem mapping and data innovation, is that it's important for us to remember that you're all working for government. These are values-based organizations. You're there to serve your constituents. You are essentially a social impact, mission-oriented organization. So you can kind of also have this concept that, well, engaging them is part of the values of our work. It's part of our responsibility to actually engage a broad set of stakeholders. So I wanted to make sure to touch on that as a reason as well. And so briefly, just want to share, well, which of this list of stakeholders tends to fall under which reasons? I think, these are a subset that are often, engaged for the purpose of getting sign off for resources. And, this can definitely always vary. These are often stakeholders we engage to mitigate risks. Let me get a press piece out before the press finds out about it. This way I can control the narrative a little bit. Let me engage that, perhaps grumpy elected official ahead of time. This way they're going to understand where we're coming from. And, these are all very strategic decisions and really important when we're thinking about effective implementation. So I'm not trying to negate any of these. But what's interesting is up until now, the first three bullets under external have not necessarily been highlighted. And so I do want to just, push everyone to consider that it can often, like, engaging the public can unfortunately often be overlooked, because the public at large, they're not going to give you sign off for resources. And yes, you could think about engaging the public as a way of mitigating risks, definitely. And I think that often, to be honest, engaging the public can be a powerful way of mitigating risks. But this is a set of stakeholders that sometimes, if we're operating too quickly, we might not have the time to engage, can often be overlooked. And I would just kind of like push everyone to think about, how might you engage the public? Maybe it isn't relevant for the stage of the data innovation that you're in right now. Maybe it's not relevant for the data innovation more broadly, but make sure that you think about it. Think about this set of stakeholders and assess why or why not, in terms of why it might make sense for you to consider engaging them over the course of your data innovation. And so to quickly share just a few kind of tactics and approaches for like understanding your stakeholders and ecosystem mapping. This is very overly simplified, but you can start with understanding who's already using your data innovation. So a few of you are working on version 2, version 3 of something that's already existed. Some of you are launching something brand new. So if you're launching something brand new, it's a bit of a more theoretical exercise, but what are adjacent projects or things that are related and where you could engage people that are already involved with your work? And then secondly, discovering who might become a stakeholder. So in terms of who's already using your product or service, there's a variety of different tools often available. If it's a digital product, web analytics, focus groups, desk research, one-on-one interviews, user testing, surveys. I wanted to share kind of a brief, Samuel Engelberg was with my former team at the Mayor's Office of Data Analytics in the spring and summer of 2018. And he actually, when I was managing New York City's open data program at the time, really dug into the Google Analytics of the platform. I knew, okay, people are coming to this site, but like, what are they doing? How do we learn more about them? And it was really fascinating. He was able to really kind of dig into, and I'm happy to share the link to this report. It's publicly available on the New York City Open Data program page. But really kind of looking at the data in terms of usage, who's coming to the site, how often, really provide us with insights that we didn't have before from a usage perspective. Some people are coming to the site to fact check. You know, that was 16% of the sessions that were coming to this digital platform. And these were the data sets that they were often fact checking. We were able to share that back with the city agencies, and it was actually extremely useful from a stakeholder engagement perspective. Because now, as the manager of the open data program at the time, I could go back to the NYPD and say, it's really important that you're updating this motor vehicle collisions data set. Like, look at how many sessions you have. We believe that there's people who come to fact check information. And it was able to like give them a reason to continue getting involved with the program. So, you know, data-driven work and kind of stakeholder engagement is possible as well. We also had a lot of taxi drivers engaging on the platform in order to get information to do their jobs. There's a whole lot of other interesting insights, and I'm happy again to share the report. And then in terms of discovering who might become a stakeholder, so this is another report and that was done, a bit of research while I was with the Mayor's Office of Data Analytics, managing the open data program to understand who might be able to use the data. So we engaged a local group called Reboot that does really great work with governments and social impact organizations. I can share the link to this as well. And I was actually just talking to Nicholas and his team about this work yesterday. I've seen it before. But essentially, the design research work here was to speak to a variety of people that we knew, ask those individuals for recommendations of others to speak to, others to speak to, others to speak to basically get out of the network of people that we knew. I'll skip over this piece and essentially develop what are called user personas. This is a tool that's often used in marketing. It's a sketch that represents like a type of person. It's, you know, not to be seen as an ultimate truth. You know, putting people into profile buckets can also be very problematic. So I don't want to emphasize this as the end all be all way to think about users or stakeholders. But when you're not quite sure what's happening with a product or a service that you're providing, it can sometimes be helpful to understand, okay, in terms of our current users, we have folks who are really focused on mapping. We have folks who are really focused on kind of the influential interpreter, you know, acting as a liaison for their communities for the data. And then in terms of potential open data users, people that we think are open data curious, but not yet engaging, like here's a little bit about them. And that was honestly extremely helpful for us in reaching out to new communities and helping them to get to know about open data. It opened my eyes to the fact that there was a strong nonprofit use case for open data, which was a whole community that we hadn't really involved before. So again, profiles are to be used with caution and responsibility, but can be a pretty powerful tool for ecosystem mapping and understanding stakeholders. Other kind of last takeaways are I do encourage you to just kind of operationalize stakeholder management, create mechanisms to learn more from your stakeholders on an ongoing basis, have a way for people to sign up to learn more, as simple as like a Google form or other sign up form, share updates via email when you have those updates. Depending on the robustness of your data innovation, maybe you need a customer service interface. Is it tied into your 311 program? Can you have a way for people to report back bugs so that they're not tweeting when there is a problem? Like, give people a pathway to engage with you. Check in with very active stakeholders who are very interested. Don't ignore them. Maybe host public events to let people know like what's happening with your data innovation. And then secondly, I would say be prepared to be caught off guard by who self-selects as a stakeholder. There are going to be people who are interested in your work that you might not have thought were interested in your work. And, you know, hopefully they make that known in a friendly and positive way. But either way, I think it's always a good sign, I think, when more people, more often than not, are interested in what you're doing. And lastly, recommend, you know, whether it's a spreadsheet or a customer relationship management tool, a CRM, have a place for all these contacts. Put them in one spot, name, email address, what kind of stakeholder they are. This way your team is just very clear on who needs to stay up to date throughout your project. So I know that was warp speed, hopefully a few interesting ideas and concepts. And I'm really happy to hand this over to Andrew and also have him introduce himself, because not all of you have had the opportunity to meet him yet. So Andrew, I'll pass it off to you.
Thanks so much, Adrienne, and hello, everyone. I see a few familiar faces, but it's great to meet, to see all of the old friends and meet the new ones here today. I'm Andrew Young. I'm the Knowledge Director at the GovLab. And work across our data program and will be a core part of the team here supporting Adrienne throughout the Incubator program, and really excited to work with you all. I apologize for not being able to make last week's kickoff and sessions, but as you can probably hear in the background, have a new addition who's joined, who tends to only make herself known once I unmute myself, so apologies for that. But I think if there aren't any questions for Adrienne on the first section, we can jump into the discussion around building a social license for this work. And Adrienne, should I share my screen, or do you want to keep running the slides there?
I think you can go ahead and share your screen. This way you can move at your own pace. And thank you for the reminder on the questions. I forgot my own I forgot my own modifications to today's session. Yeah, if anyone has questions, we have time for one or two. You're welcome to pop them in the chat or unmute yourself, whatever you prefer.
Great, and I will run through this relatively quickly so we can get into questions as well and make sure that we have time for our guest speakers. And thanks so much everyone for joining. So kind of building off of what Adrienne was just discussing on the point of ecosystem mapping and stakeholder mapping, I wanted to briefly point to some work that we've done around what we call people-led innovation and how you can be more strategic in identifying whom to engage and how. So quite often when we talk about engaging the public, it's spoken about in relatively broad terms. I mean, who are we talking about? What does engagement mean? What does the public mean? What is the intention, the intended outcomes of that kind of engagement? So we've done a little bit of work with the Bertelsmann Foundation on building out a methodology for doing this in a more strategic kind of manner. And I won't go through this in great detail, and a lot of this kind of aligns with what Adrienne was just talking about, but the methodology that we developed involves first identifying which types of stakeholder would be relevant to engage for a particular question or opportunity or policy decision. So recognizing that in some cases you might want to engage residents at large in a broad sense. In other cases, you might be looking for those domain experts who might be based at the local universities or know everything there is to know about the tax code in a certain area or whatever the topic at hand might be. Anchor institutions, whether they be, again, local universities or church groups or other entities, really recognizing what is that mapping of important voices or perspectives that could be brought to the table. And then similarly thinking about the how of the engagement. Are we asking folks to comment on their priorities and preferences? Are we asking for a manner of co-creation and collaboration around developing some new solution, whether it be a project, whether it be a policy instrument, whether it be any other type of data innovation that you all are working on in the incubator for the next 6 months here, reviewing work already done, or reporting, providing facts that can inform the development of these kind of instruments and innovations, and recognizing, what that strategy is in terms of the who and in terms of the how can lead to more useful and meaningful input from the public, which helps to improve the functioning of or the development or implementation of your innovation, but also allows for that feedback to be put into practice in a way that gives those people who are engaged the sense that what they provided you was actually acted upon, which I think is really important. Often we hear in these kind of engagement discussions that people lended their time, provided their input, their preferences, and then nothing happened. And that is in many cases more disincentivizing than not having that engagement in the first place. So having that really structured and nuanced type of engagement strategy can really actually unlock actionable insights and feedback rather than what we sometimes refer to as that engagement theater. So we will share the link to all of this work at people@innovation.org. And the last thing I'll say here is just we have a framework that we use to help map out how you would go about this type of people-led innovation engagement with the mapping of the whom to engage and the how at the top, and thinking about where across the policy making or problem solution development life cycle this type of engagement would happen. So, and I should say, Adrienne, feel free to stop me if I'm going on too long. I want to make sure I stick within my time here. But the core thing that I wanted to discuss with you all today is this question of how to gain a social license for data reuse and data innovation in different contexts. And our friends in New York City, of course, are familiar with this project that the GovLab led last year at the peak of or initiated last year at the peak of the pandemic here in New York City, what we call the Data Assembly, which was the first citizens assembly on the reuse of data, in this case specifically focused on the reuse of data to address COVID-19 in New York City. And this was a project that we did together with a number of partners to tap into the perspectives of citizens, civil rights and advocacy organizations, key data holders across sectors, and policymakers to build out a social license for the type of data reuse that was beginning to ramp up to address the pandemic in the city, and also especially to develop the kinds of design principles and guidance that would enable stakeholders involved in these kind of data reuse efforts to align their practices with the perspectives of the public at large, as well as certain expert stakeholders who have particular kind of familiarity or interest in some of the issues at hand that can come into play in a data reuse kind of context. So as I mentioned, this involved a few different groups of participants, what we call mini publics. The first mini public involved, as I said, key data holding organizations across sectors, including especially businesses, as well as government policymakers and city government folks who actually share their data through open data portals and the like to enable kind of external reuse of that information. Representatives from rights and advocacy organizations, so think folks who work on issues for the unhoused or for immigrants or other potentially vulnerable communities or perspectives that might not always be at the table for these kinds of data and policy making kind of discussions. And then finally, a mini public that brought together a group of diverse New Yorkers from across the 5 boroughs to participate in this kind of discussion on what would constitute responsible data reuse in the context of COVID-19. And the way that we did this, so recognizing, again, we're kind of getting into the engaging whom and engaging how. So that was the who. And then the way that we organized the discussions was, rather than saying, would you be comfortable with the reuse of data for COVID-19 or the reuse of your data for COVID-19? Yes, no, maybe. We worked toward having a bit more of a nuanced discussion around what are those choices or decision points or design principles that would help to align that practice of data reuse with those perspectives among these key groups. And the way that we did that was using what we called exhibits of hypothetical but realistic examples inspired by real world practice of data reuse projects. And we presented these to each of these mini public groups to have something concrete and tangible to discuss when we're talking about all of these choices that go into the operations and governance of these types of efforts. So in one case, I won't go through these in great detail, but in one case, we focused on mobility data information collected by telecommunications companies from smartphones that was then aggregated and shared with academic researchers and government health agencies to inform their understanding of how people are responding to social distancing provisions and the like. A second one around the collection of 311 data, so non-emergency reporting, being made accessible through a public open data portal, but also being used for enforcement of folks not wearing masks on the subway or people having a barbecue. This was in July of 2020, having a barbecue in their backyard in Brooklyn without the necessary social distancing and the like. And then finally, the use of consumer data, i.e. credit card data, to better understand the economic impacts of the pandemic and how it's affecting employment, consumer spending, and the like. And then throughout that, using those three, my slides seem to be stuck. There we go. Using those exhibits as the basis for discussion, we took the participants through a discussion framework that sought to be as simple as possible to enable everyone to engage despite their or with no regard to their kind of level of experience in the space, but also a level of specificity to, again, unlock this kind of actionable insights. So we really asked people to go through the why, the purpose, the central intention or objectives of the effort, the what are the data assets themselves, how is the data at hand, constituted, or is it aggregated? Are we talking about credit card company data versus smartphone derived data? How does that impact your view and perspectives on the project at hand? The who, which parties are involved, which individuals are represented in the data sets? The how, what kind of processes and procedures are in place? Are you gaining meaningful consent? Are you being transparent in the operations throughout the process? What are the kind of contractual or legal instruments that are in place that are guiding the effort? The when, questions especially around retention. How long is the data being shared? How long is it being held? How do you ensure end-to-end data responsibility, recognizing that this work all occurs on a kind of life cycle? And how do you plan for downstream potential risks or opportunities and make sure that they remain aligned with those citizen perspectives? And then finally, the where, thinking about the localized creation of value, as well as any place-based opportunities and risks. And using this framework to guide the discussion, these are some design principles that came out of our mini public consultations. And I won't go through them in great detail here, but suffice to say that with a broad swath of New York City stakeholders, from the head of data at a large private sector company or the head of a city government agency, to an individual from Staten Island who joined on to a public consultation and had no real experience with these kind of issues or concepts, we were able to hone in on some really concrete and actionable kind of design principles that could inform better practices in their work going forward. So a few takeaways. I'm happy to discuss any more of the ins and outs of the kind of structure of the data assembly engagement effort. I'm not going to get into these in great detail, but these were some other cross-cutting recommendations that came out of the work that you can see on the screen here, and we'll certainly share all of these materials. But I think the 4 big takeaways from that effort from my end were, really in lieu of trying to engage everyone before starting your work in order to obtain a social license, there can sometimes be opportunities to seek out ways to tap into representative, random, diverse, expert, lay perspectives, depending on what's most useful and relevant for the topic at hand, and being more strategic in that who can be really useful and more workable than trying to engage everyone as a starting point. The second one is around designing engagements in a way that's specific and nuanced and structured enough to allow for participants with different levels of experience and capacity to meaningfully engage. So here, talking about exhibits and concrete examples rather than high-level concepts or broad, open-ended, vague kind of questions around what are your feelings on X, Y, or Z. Third is around really focusing on translating input and lessons learned into concrete design principles that can inform data innovation, development, and iteration, and then testing those principles going forward to ensure that they remain useful. And then finally, one of the key terms for this discussion is providing broader transparency around this work, as well as subsequent efforts to inform, and ensuring that we're informing a broader public about how this work is going forward, even if they aren't directly engaged in these kind of assemblies and other types of engagement strategies that I was just discussing. So I will leave it there, and back to you, Adrienne.
All right, thank you, Andrew. And it's a great pleasure to introduce Brittny-Jade Saunders, a former colleague from the city of New York, a brilliant leader, and I'll let her take it from here. But really, really glad to have her here to share her expertise and experience with us today.
Thank you so much, Adrienne. And it really is my pleasure to be here with everyone. As Adrienne mentioned, I used to work with her at the City of New York. So it's really a pleasure to be with all these other folks who are so committed to doing innovative and important things in government. I'm going to quickly just, let's see, hold on one second, share my screen and get this presentation up and running. All right. Great, one moment. All right. So as Adrienne mentioned, I'm currently principal for a consultancy that I just started called Review Strategies, and our focus is really on trying to build power and will and resources for multiracial democracy here in the US, and taking an expansive view of that. The first point that I want to make is just about the importance of placing, our tasks together and the work that you're going to be doing as part of the City Incubator in kind of a broader context. So, of course, the really the question, right, that you've all gathered here to try to answer over these few weeks is, how might we better equip cities to solve problems with data? And I think the point that I want to start by making is that there are kind of longstanding histories of discrimination and exclusion based on things like race, ethnicity, gender, disability, sexual orientation, immigration status, all sorts of other characteristics that influence how people view government. And those same histories also inform how people understand, what problems are, whether there actually are problems, and whether solutions are possible, and if so, what those solutions might be. And so the image I have here is a redlining map from New York City, but redlining was a broader practice used across the US. And a set of policies and practices, rather, instituted by the federal government that basically restricted home loans in Black communities and other communities of color. And so I just want to offer this to kind of share that, like, for, depending on who you are and what your history is and your connection to a policy like this might be, it could be a deeply personal, painful experience, right, that impacts how much trust you have in government, whether you would be willing to work in government, whether you actually believe that government is, supposed to or intends to deliver for you in communities like yours. Or if you are not someone with a personal connection to this history or awareness of this history, it could be almost invisible. So that's kind of the first kind of larger contextual point I want to make. I also want to say that like a lot of my examples are grounded in my experience working in the US context, but I also feel like these kind of principles and ideas are kind of relevant across the board. So I hope that you find the same. Similarly, thinking not just about these histories of discrimination and exclusion, but also thinking about like kind of current context. There really is a tremendous need to demonstrate that government is worthy of trust, can deliver meaningful improvements in people's lives, and is really a vehicle for collective problem solving that everyone should be able to participate in and should benefit from, regardless of their race or their ethnicity, sexual orientation, or other characteristics. And that's both because of the histories that I was talking about earlier, and because, realistically, because of concerted efforts by some to really undermine people's faith in government and people's willingness to invest in government and people's belief that government can actually solve problems. So the work that you all are doing, I think, is an incredibly important piece of trying to kind of counteract that. Okay. Oh, wait a minute. Okay. Sorry, went ahead of myself on the slides. So the issue or two issues that I'm digging in today on are bias inherent in data and bias inherent in data tools. And so I'm offering just a few kind of examples and high-level ideas that I'm sure folks in this group are quite familiar with, but just offering a little space for us to dig in together and then look forward to chatting about your questions. But the basic take-home point is, of course, that biases in the real world find their way into our data, right? So policies and practices and attitudes, frankly, that might be racist or sexist or ableist, meaning that they discriminate against people with disabilities, they can fuel government or private action. And then those actions are in turn captured in data and can reinforce the negative perceptions about groups that have been targeted for discrimination and exclusion. But I also want to make the point that when analyzed in a way that's sensitive to the realities of discrimination and exclusion, data can also be a tool for achieving greater equity and justice, which I'm sure is part of what motivated many of you to kind of take on this work and become involved in this effort. And so, some of the kind of common examples that are cited in this space often have to do with law enforcement. So, for example, things like stop, question, and frisk, which was a practice of, stopping people on the street, questioning them, searching them, which had been found over time, both in New York and in lots of other places, to be racially discriminatory, right? So here in New York, Black New Yorkers, Latinx New Yorkers were, disproportionately likely to be targeted for these practices. But you see the same sorts of patterns in vehicle stops as well, right? So you have people of color being targeted for vehicle stops by law enforcement, way out of proportion to their kind of presence within the population. Luckily, however, we had a situation where there were many racial justice groups, civil rights groups, human rights organizations, academics, and others who were committed to kind of digging deeper into this data and kind of lifting out these disproportionalities, right? And that helped to contribute to a situation where there were laws passed at the local level and at the state level, both requiring data collection and transparency, and then also in many jurisdictions prohibiting racial profiling in law enforcement. Now, obviously, this is not a problem that has been solved either by that data analysis or by those measures, but it is kind of an example both of how kind of biases flow into data through discriminatory policies and practices, but also how data can be a tool for trying to change some of that and shift some of that. And similarly, right, you have seen in the last 10 years that many jurisdictions have turned to algorithms to assist with sentencing decisions in criminal proceedings. both in order to, deal with very high caseloads, but also in some cases out of a belief that, artificial intelligence or algorithms is kind of better positioned to make unbiased determinations than human beings themselves. But this is proven problematic in some places, as these tools have been found to produce racially biased predictions. Of course, many of you will have read the 2016 study by ProPublica about the Compass system that's used in some jurisdictions. And one study found that Black defendants were 45% more likely to be assigned to higher risk categories than white defendants, even when controlling for prior crimes, future recidivism, age, or gender. But this is not just kind of a problem in the space of criminal law enforcement. We've seen that with the pandemic, there's increased demand for services that allow for remote job interviews, right? And the creators of some of these tools have claimed to be able to assess candidate suitability using artificial intelligence, with one even claiming that they could analyze facial expressions and make determinations about fitness or suitability on that basis. And of course, that is problematic from a number of perspectives, given the kind of cultural differences in how people respond to questions or to facial expressions, different things about how folks present themselves, but then also issues for folks with disabilities who might also present differently. Now, luckily in that particular case with that particular vendor, they ended up adjusting their approach because of a lot of public blowback. But even candidate screening tools in the employment context that do not analyze images of applicants, and instead just rely on information that might be included in someone's resume or a profile that they put together, can reinforce discriminatory patterns if they're trained on historical data that captures old patterns of exclusion and discrimination. So it's not just an issue in the criminal justice space, it's an issue in the employment space and in many other spaces, sadly, because racial bias and other forms of bias are kind of baked into, so many of our systems across the board. Bias can also become a feature of data tools when we fail to focus on inclusion at early stages of design as well, right? So think questions that we might ask ourselves in developing projects. And these are questions that I ask myself, not as a data person in government, but when we were designing something as simple as a program or a presentation or some other effort to engage with the public, would be, how will people with disabilities be able to engage in this and participate in this rather? So how can folks participate in data collection and interact with data once it's shared with the public? Do we have the right systems in place to promote accessibility? Similarly, how will people who speak different languages be able to interact with this project, to co-create it, to interact with it on the back end once it's produced? And also questions around technology access that track to income and race and other characteristics as well are also relevant. So if folks don't have a high-speed internet connection, how are they going to be able to participate in this survey that we've placed online? Or do we need other methodologies to be able to kind of to gather their perspectives and to learn from them? Let's see if we just a little bit stuck, but it looks like it's coming through. Hold on. There we go. Okay. So, in an effort to kind of provide some concrete thoughts on like what folks can do, I just wanted to, lift up a couple of points. So one is you can ask questions, right? And I think this is very consistent with the themes that Adrienne and Andrew raised as well, which is who has been excluded historically, who is being excluded now, right? And then based on the answers to those questions, so you can make an effort to really align yourself with those communities and those populations, and try to figure out, what are the community organizations, the advocacy organizations, other folks who are working on the issues that are closely related to the problem that you're trying to solve, right? How can you seek to understand their needs and what you can do to help support those needs? Can you consult with them regularly and really work to build that trust that might foster deeper engagement and a better product overall? And then the final point was to advocate. I'm trying to go back to my slide, but that's fine. The last point, the last A, was just advocate. So figure out how you can try to bring some of those folks themselves into spaces where decisions are made. Figure out how you can use some of the I think the influence and the credibility that you have as folks who are, data analysts, and how you can leverage that for the benefit of other folks whose voices may not always be heard or credited in the same ways. So I will pause there and just with a word of thank you for your work, and look forward to any questions that folks may have. I'll also stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Brittany. Really, really appreciate that overview. And so with no more ado, and thank you for your patience also. I know it's very early in California. We'll hand it over to Christine, Julia, and Beatriz.
Thank you so much, Adrienne. I know we're running short on time, so I'm going to have Julia and Beatriz just go ahead and start setting up the slides. I did want to just give some more framing on their backgrounds and why it's so relevant to kind of our initiative around community engagement. And so just quick overview. So Julia is our data equity project manager, but she's also a professional storyteller and writer. She actually used to work for Off-Broadway Theater before joining the city of San Jose to lead communications. And Beatriz is actually second-year MBA student at the MIT Sloan School of Management. And prior to business school, she actually spent 5 years working at at the intersection of public policy and communications, most recently serving as head speech writer at for the prior and current presidents of Planned Parenthood. So you guys are in really, really good hands in terms of experts on the subject, and really excited to hand it over to Beatriz and Julia to talk about their fantastic work.
Great. Thanks, Christine, for that introduction. Hi, everyone. I'm Julia, project manager and communications lead here at San Jose's Mayor's Office of Tech and Innovation, which for the rest of the presentation we'll call MODI for short, because that's a bit of a mouthful. So just for some background, at MODI, our office leverages technology to address the most pressing issues facing San Jose. We're mostly working to foster a data-driven culture within the city, as well as democratize the economic benefits of tech for all through engaging, accessible, and reliable products, as well as implementing a citywide infrastructure for addressing the digital divide. Next slide, please. And for those on the call who may not be familiar with San Jose, we are in Northern California here, and here are a few notes at a glance for some of the communities we serve, as well as the very particular local context you have to keep in mind at every level of our work. Just a few things to point out. We're very culturally diverse, and in 57% of homes, English is not the primary language spoken, which, thank you, Brittany, earlier, and Beatriz will speak more on this later when she talks about how she went about building our community engagement for the summer. We are considered the capital of Silicon Valley and the headquarters for companies like PayPal, Zoom, and Adobe, and we were the first city in California to implement a citywide privacy policy. Next slide, please. So no equity work can be started, let alone accomplished, without a nuanced understanding of the communities we serve. And for those looking in from the outside, San Jose's position might not look like it will merit a serious conversation just because we are, the capital of Silicon Valley, and the region is known for access and wealth, and our perceived growth has exacerbated a lot of socioeconomic issues that already exist, like the digital divide and homelessness. Next slide, please. And just for everyone on the call, when you talk about equity, I know that's a very broad term and you can ask 5 people and get 5 different responses, but just for our framing at MODI, we define data equity as using the city's data ethically and in ways that drive equitable outcomes for our constituents. Next slide. And before we get into the weeds on data equity, I really want to personally acknowledge a lot of the partnerships that we've cultivated that have made our work and growth over the last about year of our pilot program possible. So for everyone on this call, our primary funder and mentor for day one of our pilot program has been the Knight Foundation, who supports not only the work of our team, but also numerous projects throughout the city of San Jose, as well as nationwide. Since Christine joined the city last year, we've grown from a team of herself as one person to around 20 people over the summer. And we've been very intentional about this growth by building a multidisciplinary team. So we're not just data scientists, but also storytellers like myself, as well as policy enthusiasts like Beatriz. So the majority of us didn't come from a public sector background. We were all like university students and private sector folks. So how we built this team was we partnered first and foremost with our local university, which is San Jose State University. Their campus is right across from City Hall. And that way we brought in data science master's students who really understood the city we're serving and who actually live and work in San Jose. So we had these graduates come in to help on the data side, but we also courted folks who were graduates of bootcamp programs like Galvanize and Correlation One. So we also found career changers, folks who may not have started in data science, but through a very non-traditional pathway ended up in the industry. So we've been able to grow a team all remotely over the past year that is really representative of the communities we serve and are mostly historically underrepresented in the industry at large. Next slide. So when it comes to our team's methodology, we've taken like rigor that people are mostly familiar with applying in the private sector and brought it into municipal government, which means that a lot of our emphasis when it comes to the data side is using administrative data over survey data. So for everyone on the call, in San Jose, the annual resident survey usually gets around an 11% response rate, which is not incredible, but raw city system data, which a lot of the departments are sitting on, like when we talk about admin data, we can talk about like Parks and Rec as an example. When a family signs up for a scholarship program, the information they input for registration, that is the city system data. So that data source is robust and underutilized for the most part, just because a lot of people in the city don't have the capacity to access and really leverage what they have. So data shouldn't be the sole factor in influencing policy, but we really want to empower these day-to-day city operators to better leverage the insights that they may not know how to use. Next slide. And now we arrive at our framework, which is the bulk of what we want to talk about today. So every city department measures equity differently. So an equitable outcome for our Parks, Recreation, Neighborhood Services team, we can't apply that broadly to the Department of Transportation. So what we came up with is this very lightweight and flexible system that can be adapted to a multitude of different needs across the city, as well as is scalable and sustainable, but still has a very clear core of common values. So this framework was developed by our Chief Data Officer and Harvard Business School Leadership Fellow, Christine, who introduced us earlier, as well as a former data scientist at Harvard, Matthew Finney. So the framework you see has 3 distinct stages, which are outlined above. So when we start collaborating with city departments, we facilitate a series of workshops to help the staff align on a single equity objective. And this objective, they may arrive at one after 3 workshops, a lot of group discussion, but we have an understanding that that objective may change over time, depending on the department's needs, as well as the analyses we're running. So once the objective has been decided, our data scientists work with city stakeholders to define equity metrics with which to guide their analyses. And then the 3rd step is monitoring and evaluation, and this is a bit more flexible in terms of timeline. So it's kind of finding out how to support the objective and the work long-term and embed it into the city in a way that doesn't feel temporary and will, like, if our team rolls off at any point, it'll just leave with us. Next slide. So this is a sample timeline for how our data scientists specifically work. So the way our team functions, we partner with these city departments and we really serve as consultants as well as extensions of their staff over the duration of the work we're doing. So to date, we've collaborated with city stakeholders in Parks and Recreation, as well as San Jose 311, which provides non-emergency services to the city using a request-based system. We've also worked with homeless programs, and we're currently doing an open data project in partnership with DataKind, which is a nonprofit that kind of works with data scientists for social good work. So our team just presented at the EAA-CMO conference yesterday, which is fantastic for the work, and we're very happy that their incredible work is out there in such a prestigious forum. Next slide, please. And at the end of the day, what we really want to keep in mind is that we're not just doing data analysis for data analysis' sake, and we've failed if our work remains an intellectual exercise and none of our residents actually know we're doing this. So we failed if our output is just analyses, dashboards, and databases. We failed if equitable outcomes aren't actually being driven for people who live in San Jose. And there is no end point to this work. Like, we're not working towards like one set goal, and we've developed a roadmap here that hopefully will make it so that data equity can be sustained for the long term. And we've made some progress, and very heartening progress, in the sense that we were included in the June budget message that was presented to City Council, and we're currently in the process of hiring a data equity lead who will sit in the city manager's office to like really embed themselves and oversee that this work is grown and continued for the duration of the future. So now I'm happy to turn it over to Beatriz, who will take you on a deeper dive into our work with Parks and Recreation specifically, and how she built our community engagement strategy this summer.
Thank you very much, Julia, and thank you to all of us for having us today. Like Julia mentioned, I had the great privilege of leading a community engagement team of 4 fellows over this summer. And all of the work of our team was really rooted in this notion that Julia just mentioned, that data equities work truly fails if it remains an intellectual exercise. So we really wanted to turn it into very, very tangible, concrete outputs. And I will share a bit of how we launched a community engagement arm this summer and what we achieved through that work. Here we go. Okay, I had missed one. I'm sorry. So why community engagement? Once the gaps in access were identified by our data equity team in the programs that we were analyzing, or the services that we were analyzing, we realized that we didn't really have a cohesive process to turn those findings into policy. There were questions that our data just could not answer. So we did have the gaps in access, but what was actually driving them? Which barriers were affecting which of the communities that were accessing those services? And most importantly, what kind of changes to policies to these programs and services could actually help us make the services more accessible to the residents who needed them most? In short, the data analysis told us a story, but we wanted to be able to validate our findings by speaking to the communities who access the services and programs every single day, and of course, find solutions that actually work for these communities. So with that, since the community engagement team was made up of fellows that were only working for the summer, it was really important that in order to advance the work of data equity, we met 2 specific criteria on our launching of community engagement. First, we needed to yield tangible policy proposals in the short term so that we knew that this was a project that we could turn around as we engage in new data pilots that could immediately bring results, not only to the departments that we were partnering with, but also to the communities that were helping by giving us feedback and engaging with our work. And second, we needed a model for community engagement that we could actually replicate and take to scale for all of the programs that we would be analyzing this administrative data for. And so our work over the summer really centered around our most mature project to date, the Parks and Recreation Citywide Scholarship Program. For a quick review of what this program is, essentially it serves as a main source of childcare subsidies in the city of San Jose. Parks and Recreation offers this fantastic after-school care and summer programs that fall below private cost of childcare, but the costs that you're seeing here on the right are still prohibitive to many of the most needy families that we have in the city. And so the city has created this program that uses thresholds such as free and reduced lunch to offer up to 75% of the cost of after-school and summer programs. And so our data analysis for this program showed some great results in distribution that we were really encouraged to see. For example, there was an equal distribution across genders, so boys and girls were receiving scholarship at equal rates. But we also found areas of deep inequity that we wanted to better understand. And this came across family size, income level, and even geography. The goal of our engagement process was really to bring all of these findings, good and bad, to the community. And we did not want to ask leading questions. We simply wanted to bring these data points that we were finding to get first reaction from stakeholders in the community and also from the people who were accessing the services directly. So we met individually with community partners and community organizations to introduce our findings and hear their initial reactions to the data. We facilitated roundtables with these organizational leaders and the Parks and Recreation leaders because we wanted to bring the conversation into an area where we could start talking not just about the problems, but actually policy solutions and policy changes that could be implemented. And finally, we started to collect direct feedback from parents and youth, not only on the quality of these programs, but also the main barriers that they were facing when they were partaking in the scholarship process in order to access childcare. And so more concretely, what did this look like? Our team put together a list of not only contacts that we had from the city, because we know that not everyone who accesses programs always has strong bonds of trust and open lines of communications with City Hall, but also we went out of our way to focus on stakeholders that we felt would be really interested in having these conversations. And there are two main groups, two main buckets that we targeted. Number one, there were people who felt that everyday work with youth and parents. And number two, we wanted to talk with hubs in the community that actually serve as a resource of childcare support or any other kind of financial support for communities that are more marginalized in San Jose. So this is where we target school administrators, youth organizations, family resource centers, culturally based organizations and faith-based organizations. And we heard a bit about that in the previous presentation too, on how these groups are critical to engage. And at the same time, we then moved on to 50 partner presentations to the stakeholders that seemed most interested in hearing about our data analysis. And by the end of the summer, we hosted 3 community roundtables with 20 of these partners that had been most engaged in the policymaking process. So they actually wanted to work with City Hall to shift how we were distributing these scholarships in order to have this conversation, again, with the leaders of the Parks and Recreation Department to better understand how we could implement quick changes that lower the barriers to access for these programs. And what collecting community feedback looked like, we actually wanted to give a shout out to the city of New York, where we know that some of the participants at least are from, because we went talk to city government employees everywhere to hear about their best practices for collecting community feedback. And Oscar Romero, who's the director of inclusive innovation in the New York City Mayor's Office of the CTO, gave us this incredible feedback structure where you could target problems. So what is broken? People would say, look, I have simply never heard of this scholarship program. And that would be an example of what that box would look like. Concerns, which would target what the access barriers and the structural barriers to accessing these programs would be. So for example, if you do get promotional materials, but they are only in English, you're not really targeting a lot of the most low-income populations in San Jose who needed these services. And finally, solutions. What were some of the changes that could actually increase equity for these programs? And this is an example of where our feedback tracker looks like. It by no means captures all of what we got, but something that was really encouraging when we talked to the community is that we actually had more solutions than we had problems. And so by the end of the summer, we put together a booklet of recommendations that were driven by and created by the community and focusing on 5 pillars that they had offered as deep areas of program improvement. We had marketing, scholarships, structure, application process, transportation, because there's no point in having a service that everyone can apply to if they cannot actually go ahead and access it. And finally, and this is a really, really important one, the community members and community-based organizations really wanted the city to rethink how we communicated with them. They have deep ties to the communities. They have worked on trust, and while they want the city to do that work, they also want to be a funnel that allows the city to bring the services and information to the people who need these resources. And while we are really heartened by this big booklet of around, I think, 36 policy proposals that we put together for Parks and Recreation, while the work of implementation is still going on, we were most encouraged to see that actually the work that we were doing through community engagement was already having some real tangible results on how the city dealt with childcare directly and how it helped promote it and how it helped get feedback from the community. So for example, in one of our phone calls over this summer, we were speaking to a family resource center associated with the church, and they told us that they were doing a canvas in the upcoming month through 1,000 of the most low-income households in San Jose. And this canvas was mostly focused around bringing resources for back to school to parents who were sending their children back to school for the first time since COVID. And they asked if we happened to have a flyer and a scholarship application that we could bring to them so that they could distribute it to these households. And again, these are households that the city does not always reach through communications. They are not in our mailing list. They do not necessarily walk by a parks and recreation center where they get to see a poster. And we brought that information and that application to apply for that resource directly through their home with this partnership. We also realized in our conversation with partners that many of them who actually even work in helping connect parents to childcare didn't know about the scholarship program. And so part of it had to do with the kind of resources we had. We didn't have great information or 3-pagers on the program, but also on how accessible that information was. So our team developed an FAQ section that we gave to the Parks and Recreation program for their website on the what, when, and how of applying to the scholarship program. And we also created a new scholarship 3-pager that very clearly delineated for partners who would be now our connection point to community members, how to apply for this scholarship and what this scholarship had to offer. And finally, San Jose right now is truly trying to do its best job to target its very diverse community by translating all of its public materials when possible to Spanish and Vietnamese, and sometimes Chinese. But when we were accessing community feedback, we actually had for partners in the Punjabi and Korean population that they barely get to have their community members actually give feedback to City Hall because of the language barrier. And so we launched and developed a survey in English, Spanish, Vietnamese, Chinese, Punjabi, and Korean so that we could continue to collect feedback as we improved the program from parents directly and from youth on how they were able to access the scholarship and how they were able to access the program and what could actually make it easier for them to take advantage of this resource that is so deeply needed as parents are returning to work and children are returning to school and we're getting back to normal.